Welcome to New Directions 99. My name is introduction is 99. There's too much bass, less bass. My name is Ed, and today I'll be reading as part of today's performance The Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard. This book right here, Jean-François Lyotard. I'll be reading the main section, including the please. I'll be reading the main section of the book, not including the foreword by Fredric Jameson, only including the introduction by Leotard, only parts written by Leotard. I will also not be reading the notes, but I do have everything that I won't be reading here for the audience. Yeah, there's only one copy. And throughout the book, there are notes. Into the last section, there's a notes section. And when a note comes up in the text, I will say, I'll pause, and I'll say, note 41, or whatever note it is. And then you'll know if you want to reference that to look in the packet. And also, once I start, I won't be able to tell the other people, audience members, if they come in, what the deal with the notes is. So maybe some of the audience members that stay here longer can tell the other new audience members how the note system works. Also, I have some scratch paper if you want to draw or anything. I have some scratch paper here. Okay. Today's performance of The Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard is a production of Telecorps, and the text will be read by me, Bucholtz, and it is being recorded to audio cassette for possible release, the first release in the Telecorps series of post-structuralist, deconstructionalist theory books on tape that may be released at some time later in the year or possibly beginning of next year on House of Records in Pittsburgh. So you can look for that. And if you sign your name to the sign-up sheet there, as you came in, there's a sign-up sheet. If you sign your name to that, possibly you'll be on the Telecorps mailing list. You can put your address, and they'll send you more information about the books on tape if you're interested in them. Introduction to François Lyotard's Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. Translation from French by Bennington and Massumi. The text I'll be reading was printed by the University of Minnesota Press in 1986. The introduction. The object of this study is the condition of knowledge in the most highly developed societies. I have decided to use the word postmodern to describe that condition. The word is in current use on the American continent among sociologists and critics. It designates the state of our culture following the transformations which, since the end of the 19th century, have altered the game rules for science, literature, and the arts. The present study will place these transformations in the context of the crisis of narratives. Science has always been in conflict with narratives, judged by the yardstick of science, in which majority of them prove to be famous. But to the extent that science does not restrict itself to stating useful regularities and seeks the truth, it is obliged to legitimate the rules of its own game. It then produces a discourse of legitimation with respect to its own status, a discourse called philosophy. I will use the term modern to designate any science that legitimates itself with reference to a meta-discourse of this kind, making an explicit appeal to some grand narrative, such as the dialectics of spirit, the hermeneutics of meaning, the emancipation of the rational or working subject, or the creation of wealth. For example, the rule of the conscious between the sender and the addressee of a statement with truth value is deemed acceptable if it is cast in terms of a possible unanimity between rational minds. This is the Enlightenment narrative, in which the hero of knowledge works toward a good, ethico-political end, universal peace. As can be seen from this example, if a meta-narrative implying philosophy and history is used to legitimate knowledge, questions are raised concerning the validity of the instructions governing the social bond. These must be legitimated as well. Thus, justice is consigned to the grand narrative in the same way as truth. Simplified to this extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. This incredulity is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, but that progress, in turn, presupposes it. To the obsolescence of the meta-narrative's apparatus of legitimation corresponds most notably the crisis of metaphysical philosophy and of the university institution which in the past relied on it. The narrative function is losing its functors, its great hero, its great dangers, its great voyages, its great goal. It is being dispersed in clouds of narrative language elements, narrative but also unitative, prescriptive, descriptive, and so on. Conveyed within each cloud are pragmatic valences specific to its kind. Each of us lives at the intersection of many of these. However, we do not necessarily establish stable language combinations, and the properties of the ones we do establish are not necessarily communicable. Thus, the society of the future falls less with the province of a Newtonian anthropology, such as structuralism or systems theory, than pragmatics of language partners. These are many different language games, a heterogeneity of elements. They also give rise to institutions in patches, local determinism. The decision makers, however, attempt to manage these clouds of sociality according to input-output matrices, following a logic which implies that their elements are commensurable and that the whole is determinable. They allocate our lives for the growth of power. In matters of social justice and scientific truth alike, the legitimation of that power is based on its optimizing a system's performance, efficiency. The application of this criterion to all four games necessarily trails a certain level of terror, whether soft or hard. The operational, that is commensurable, or disappear. The logic of maximum performance is no doubt inconsistent in many ways, particularly with respect to contradiction in the socio-economic field. It demands both less work to lower production costs and more to lessen the social burden of the idle population. But our incredulity is now such that we can no longer expect salvation to rise from these inconsistencies, as did Marx. Still, the postmodern condition is as much a stranger to disenchantment as it is to the blind positivity of delegitimation, where after the meta-narratives can't legitimacy reside. The operating criterion is technological. It has no relevance for judging what is true or just. Is legitimacy to be found in consensus obtained through discussion, as Jürgen Habermas thinks? Such consensus does violence to the heterogeneity of language games, and invention is always born of extension. Postmodern knowledge is not simply a tool of the authorities. It refines our sensitivity to differences and reinforces our ability to tolerate the incommensurable. Its principle is not the expert's homology, but the inventor's chronology. Here is the question: is a legitimation of the social bond of just society feasible in terms of a paradox analogous to that of scientific activity? What would such a paradox be? The text that follows is an occasional one. There is important knowledge of the most highly developed societies and was presented to the Conseil des Universités of the government of Quebec at the request of its president. I would like to thank him for his kindness in allowing its publication. It remains to be said that the author of the report is a philosopher, not an expert. The latter knows what he knows and what he does not know, the former does not. One concludes with other questions, two very different language games. I combine them here with the result that neither quite succeeds. The philosopher, at least, can console himself with the thought that the formal and pragmatic analysis of certain philosophical and ethno-political discourses of legitimation, which underlies the report, will subsequently see the light of day. The report will have served to introduce that analysis from a somewhat sociologizing slant, one that truncates but at the same time situates it. Such as it is, I dedicate this report to the Institut Polytechnique de Philosophie of the University de Paris, Bennington. At this very postmodern moment that finds the university nearing what may be its end, while the institute may just be beginning.
The locus must be found in its breeding grounds. And so, only recently, a remarkable thing began to take place. Nations that had long been enemies banded together to battle this common foe. Find those breeding grounds wherever
there's too much bass. I think it's better now.
That its locust legs came from Tunisia,
that was the end of the introduction. We're now on to the main text of the book. I didn't read the contents. I didn't read out loud the table of contents. First was the foreword by Fredric Jameson, which is in the text that I passed out to the audience. Second was the introduction. After the introduction, the main text begins with the first part, the field, which is subtitled Knowledge in Computerized Societies. How's this sound? Okay. Part 2 is the problem, legitimation. Part 3 is the method, language games. Part 4, the nature of the social bond, the modern alternative. Part 5, the nature of the social bond, the postmodern perspective. Part 6, the pragmatics of narrative knowledge. Part 7, the pragmatics of scientific knowledge. Part 8, the narrative function of the legitimation of knowledge. Part 9, narratives of the legitimation of knowledge. Part 10, delegitimation. Part 11, research and its legitimation through performativity. Part 12, education and its legitimation through performativity. Part 13, postmodern science as a search for instabilities. Part 14, legitimation by parology. And finally, I'll be reading the appendix, which is entitled Answering the Question, What is Postmodernism? It'll be at the end of the day's performance. I think that it may help some to read the foreword by Jameson if you're having some trouble understanding what Leotard was talking about. It's a useful intro. Why going on with the main body of text? Postmodern Condition, Part 1, the field, knowledge in computerized societies. Our working hypothesis is that the status of knowledge is altered as societies enter what is known as the post-industrial age, and cultures enter what is known as the postmodern age. Note 1. This transition has been underway since at least the end of the 1950s, which for Europe marks the completion of Reconstruction. The pace is faster or slower depending on the country, and within countries it varies according to the sector activity. The general situation is one of temporal disjunction, which makes sketching an overview difficult. Note 2.
It may be too soon to be sure. Locusts have seemed to vanish before the past, only to reappear suddenly in force.
A portion of the description would necessarily be conjectural. At any rate, we know that it is unwise to put too much faith in futurology. Note 3.
How after 44 centuries was the defeat?
Rather than painting a picture that would inevitably remain incomplete, I will take as my point of departure a single feature, one that immediately defines our object of study. Scientific knowledge is a kind of discourse, and it is fair to say that for the last 40 years, the leading sciences and technologies have had to do with language. Phonology, the theories of linguistics. Note 4. Problems of communication and cybernetics. Note 5. Modern theories of algebra and informatics. Note 6. Computers and their languages. Note 7. Problems of translation and the search for areas of compatibility among computer languages. Note 8. Problems of information storage in data banks. Note 9. Telematics and the perfection of intelligent terminals. Note 10. And paradoxology. Note 11. The facts speak for themselves, and this list is not exhaustive. The technical transformations can be expected to have a considerable impact on knowledge. Its two principal functions, research and the transmission of acquired learning, are already feeling the effect, or will in our future. With respect to the first function, genetics provides an example that is accessible to the layman. It owes its theoretical paradigm to cybernetics. Many other examples could be cited as for the second function. It is common knowledge that the miniaturization and commercialization of machines is already changing the way in which learning is acquired, classified, made available, and exploited. Note 12. It is reasonable to suppose that the proliferation of information processing machines is having and will continue to have as much effect on the circulation of learning as did advancements in human circulation and transportation systems, and later in the circulation of sounds and visual images, the media. Note 13. The nature of knowledge cannot survive unchanged within this context of general transformation. It can fit into new channels and become operational only if the learning is translated into quantities of information. Note 14. We can predict that anything in the constituted body of knowledge that is not translatable in this way will be abandoned, and that the direction of new research will be dictated by the possibility of its eventual results being translated into computer language. The producers and users of knowledge must now, and will have to, possess the means of translating into these languages whatever they want to invent or learn. Research on translating machines is already well advanced. Note 15. Along the hegemony of computers comes a certain logic, and therefore a certain set of prescriptions determining which statements are accepted as knowledge statements. We may thus expect a thorough exteriorization of knowledge with respect to the knower, at whatever point he or she may occupy in the knowledge process. The old principle that the acquisition of knowledge is indissociable from the training, build-up, of minds, or even of individuals, is becoming obsolete and will ever become more so. The relationship of the suppliers and users of knowledge to the knowledge that they supply, and the use is now tending and will increasingly tend to assume the form already taken by the relationship of commodity producers and consumers to the commodities they produce and consume, that is, the form of value. Knowledge is and will be produced in order to be sold. It is and will be consumed in order to be valorized in a new production. In both cases, the goal is exchange. Knowledge ceases to be an end in itself. It loses its use value. Note 16. It is widely accepted that knowledge has become the principal force of production over the last few decades. Note 17. This has already had a noticeable effect on the composition of the workforce of the most highly developed countries. Note 18. And constitutes the major bottleneck for developing countries. In the post-industrial and postmodern age, science will maintain and no doubt strengthen its preeminence in the arsenal of productive capacities of the nation-states. Indeed, this situation is one of the reasons leading to the conclusion that the gap between developed and developing countries will grow ever wider in the future. Note 19. But this aspect of the problem should not be allowed to overshadow the other. which is complementary to it. Knowledge in the form of informational commodity indispensable to productive power is already and will continue to be a major, perhaps the major, stake in worldwide competition of power. It is conceivable that the nation-states will one day fight for control of information, just as they battled in the past for control over territory and afterwards for the control of access to and exploration of raw materials and cheap labor. A new field is open for industrial and commercial strategies on the one hand, and political and military strategies on the other. Note 20. However, the perspective I outlined above is not as simple as it may appear, for the mercantilization of knowledge is bound to affect the privilege of the nation-states have enjoyed, and still enjoy, with respect to the production and distribution of learning. The notion that learning falls within the purview of the state as the brain or mind of society will become more and more outdated with the increasing strength of the opposing principle, according to which society exists and progresses only if the messages circulating within it are rich in information and easy to decode. The ideology of communicational transparency, which goes hand in hand with the commercialization of knowledge, will begin to perceive the state as a commercialization, as a factor of publicity and noise. It is from this point of view that the problem with the relationship between economic and state powers threatened to arise with a new urgency. Already in the last few decades, economic powers have reached the point of imperiling the stability of the state through new forms of the circulation of capital that go by the generic name of multinational corporations. But these forms of circulation imply that the investment decisions have, at least in part, passed beyond the control of the nation states. Note 21. The question threatens to become even more thorny with the development of computer technology and telematics. Suppose, for example, that a firm such as IBM is authorized to occupy a belt in the Earth's orbital field and launch communication satellites or satellites housing data banks. Who will have access to them? Who will determine which channels of data are forbidden? The state? Or will the state simply be one of the user among others? New legal issues will be raised, and with them the question, who will know? Transformation in the nature of knowledge then could well have repercussions on the existing public powers, forcing them to reconsider their relations both de jure and de facto. With large corporations and more generally with civil society, the reopening of world market, a return to vigorous economic competition, breakdown of hegemony among American capitalism, and the decline of socialist alternative, a probable opening of the Chinese market. These and many other factors are already at the end of the 1970s preparing the states for a serious reappraisal of the role they have been accustomed to playing since the 1930s. That of guiding or even directing investments. Note 22. In this light, the new technologies can only increase the urgency of such a re-examination since they make the information used in decision-making and therefore the means of control even more mobile and subject to piracy. It is not hard to visualize learning circulating along the same lines as money instead of for its educational value or political, that is, administrative, diplomatic, or military importance. The pertinent distinction would no longer be between knowledge and ignorance, but rather, as in the case of money, between payment knowledge and investment knowledge. In other words, between units of knowledge exchanged in a daily maintenance framework, the reconstitution of the workforce, survival, versus funds of knowledge dedicated to optimizing the performance of a project. If this were the case, then communicational transparency would be similar to liberalism. Liberalism does not preclude an organization or of the flow of money in which some channels are used in decision-making while others are only good for payment of debts. One could similarly imagine flows of knowledge traveling along identical channels of identical nature, some of which would be reserved for the decision-makers, while the others would be used to repay each other person's perpetual debt with respect to the social bond. Part 2, the problem, legitimation. Part 2, the problem, legitimation. to consider the question of the status of knowledge. This scenario, akin to the one which goes by the name of computerization of society, although ours is an advanced and entirely different spirit, makes no claims of being original or even true. What is required of a working hypothesis is a fine capacity for discrimination. The scenario of the computerization of the most highly developed societies allows us to spotlight, although with the risk of excessive magnification, certain aspects of the transformation of knowledge and its effect on public power and civil institutions. Effects it would be difficult to perceive from other points of view. Our hypothesis, therefore, should not be afforded predictive value in relation to reality, but strategic value in relation to the question raised. Nevertheless, it has strong credibility in that the sense or choice of this hypothesis is not arbitrary. It has been described extensively by the experts, note 23, and is already guiding certain decisions by the governmental agencies and private firms most directly concerned, such as those managing the telecommunications industry. To some extent, then, it is already a part of observable reality. Finally, barring economic stagnation or general recession, resulting, for example, from a condition of failure to solve the world's energy problems, there is a good chance that this scenario will come to pass. It is hard to see what other direction contemporary technology could take as an alternative to the computerization of society. This is as much as to say that the hypothesis is banal, but only to the extent that it fails to challenge the general paradigm of progress in science and technology, to which economic growth and the expansion of social and political power seem to be natural complements. That scientific and technical knowledge is cumulative and is never questioned. At most, which is debated, is the form of the accumulation takes. Some picture is as regular, continuous, and unanimous. Others as periodic, discontinuous, and conflictual. Note 24. But these truisms are fallacious. In the first place, scientific knowledge does not represent the totality of knowledge. It has always existed in addition to and in competition and conflict with other kinds of knowledge, which I will call narrative in the interests of simplicity. Its characteristics will be described later. I do not mean to say that narrative knowledge can be prevail over science, but its model is related to ideas of internal equilibrium and conviviality. Note 25. Next to which, contemporary scientific knowledge cuts a poor figure, especially if it is to undergo an exteriorization with respect to the knower and alienation from its user even greater than has previously been the case. The resulting demoralization of researchers and teachers is far from negligible. It is known that during the 1960s, in all of the most highly developed societies, it reached such explosive dimensions among those preparing to practice these professions, the students, that there was noticeable decrease in productivity of laboratories and universities unable to protect themselves from its contamination. Note 26. Expecting this with the hope of fear to lead to revolution, as was often the case, is out of question. It will not change as the order of the post-industrial society overnight, but this doubt on the part of scientists must be taken into account as a major factor in evaluating the present or future status of scientific knowledge. It is all the more necessary to take it into consideration since, and this is the second point, scientific demoralization has impacted the central problem of delegitimation. I use the word in a broader sense than do contemporary theorists in discussions on the question of authority. Note 27.
It was a clear sunny morning in September.
Take any civil law as an example. It states that a given category of citizens must perform a specific kind of action. Legitimation is the process by which the legislator is authorized to promulgate such a law as a norm. Now take the example of a scientific statement. It is subject to the ruling that the statement must fulfill a given set of conditions in order to be accepted as scientific. In this case, legitimation is the process by which a legislator dealing with the scientific discourse is authorized to prescribe the stated conditions and general conditions of internal consistency and experimental verification, determining whether a statement is to be included in that discourse for consideration by scientific community. The parallel may be forced, but as we see it is not. The question of legitimacy of science has been indissociably linked to that of legitimation of the legislator since the time of Plato. From this point of view, the right to decide which is true and is not independent of the right to decide what is just, even if the statements consigned to these two authorities differ in nature. The point is that there is a strict interlinkage between the kind of nature called science and the kind called ethics and politics. They both stem from the same perspective, the same choice, if you will, the choice called the Occident. When we examine the current status of scientific knowledge at a time when science seems more completely subordinated to the prevailing powers than ever before, and, along with new technologies, is in danger of becoming a major stake in their conflicts, the question of double legitimation, far from receding into the background, necessarily comes to the fore. For it appears the most complete as that of the version, revealing that knowledge and power are simply two sides of the same question. Who decides what knowledge is, and who knows what needs to be decided? In the computer age, the question of knowledge is more, now than ever, a question of government. That was the end of part 2, the problem, legitimation. About to go on to part 3, the method, language games. The reader will already have noticed that in analyzing this problem within the framework set forth, I have favored a certain procedure, emphasizing facts of language, in particular their pragmatic aspect. Note 28. To help clarify what follows, it would be useful to summarize, however briefly, what is meant here by the term pragmatic. A denotative utterance, note 29, such as the university is sick, made in the context of a conversation or an interview, positions its sender, the person who utters the statement, its addressee, the person who receives it, and its referent, the statement, what the statement deals with, in a specific way. The utterance places and exposes the sender in the position of knower. He knows what the situation is with the university. The addressee is put in the position of having to give or refuse his assent, and the referent itself is handled in a way unique to denotators, as something that demands to be correctly identified and expressed by the statement that refers to it. If we consider a declaration such as the university is open, pronounced by a dean or rector at convocation, it is clear that the previous specifications no longer apply. Of course, the meaning of the utterance has to be understood, but that is a general condition of communication and does not aid us in distinguishing the different kinds of utterances or their specific effects. The distinctive feature of this second performative, note 30, utterance is that its effect upon the referent coincides with its pronunciation. The university is open because it has been declared open in the above-mentioned circumstances. That this is so is not subject to discussion or verification on the part of the addressee, who is immediately placed within a new context created by the utterance. As for the sender, he must be invested with the authority to make such a statement. Actually, we could say it in another way around. The sender is dean or rector, that is, he is invested with the authority to make this kind of statement only insofar as he can directly affect both the referent, the university, and the addressee, the university staff, in the manner I have indicated. A different case involves utterances of the type, give money to the university. These are prescriptions. They can be modulated as orders, commands, instructions, recommendations, requests, prayers, pleas, etc. Here the sender is clearly placed in the position of authority, using the term broadly, including authority of sinner over a God who claims to be merciful. That is, he expects the addressee to perform the action referred to. The pragmatics of prescription entail contentment changes in the posts of addressee and referent, note 31. Of a different order again is the efficiency of a question, a promise, a literary description, a narration, etc. I am summarizing. Wittgenstein, taking up the study of language again from scratch, focuses his attention on the effects of different modes of discourse. He calls the various types of utterances he identifies along the way, a few which I have listed, language games. Note 32. What he means by this term is that each of the various categories of utterance can be defined in terms of rules specifying their properties and the uses to which they can be put. In exactly the same way as a game of chess is defined by a set of rules determining the properties of each of the pieces, in other words, the proper way to move them. It is useful to make the following three observations about language games. The first is that their rules do not carry within themselves their own legitimation, but they are an object of a contract, explicit or not, between players. Which is not to say that the players invent the rules. The second is that there are no rules. There is no game. Note 33. That even infinitesimal modification of one rule alters the nature of the game. That a move or utterance that does not satisfy the rules does not belong to the game they define. A third remark is suggested by what has been just said. Every utterance should be thought of as a move in a game. This last observation brings us to the first principle underlying our method as a whole. To speak is to fight in the sense of playing, and speech acts, note 34, fall within the domain of general agnostics, note 35. This does not necessarily mean that one plays in order to win. A move can be made for the sheer pleasure of its invention. What else is involved in the labor of language harassment undertaken by popular speech and by literature? Great joy is had in the endless invention of turns of phrase, of words and meanings, the process behind the evolution of language on the level of parole. But undoubtedly, even this pleasure depends on a feeling of success won at the expense of the adversary, at least one adversary, and an formidable one, the accepted language or connotation. This idea of agnostics of language should not make us lose sight of the second principle, which stands as a complement to it and governs our analysis, that the observable social bond is composed of language moves. An elucidation of this proposition will take us to the heart of the matter at hand. That was the end of part 3, the method of language games. In a moment I'll begin part 4, the nature of the social bond, the modern alternative. Part 4, the nature of the social bond, the modern alternative. If we wish to discuss knowledge in the most highly developed contemporary society, we must answer the preliminary question of what methodological representation to apply to that society. Simplifying to the extreme, it is fair to say that in principle there have been, at least over the last half-century, two basic representational models for society. Either society forms as a functional whole, or it is divided in two. An illustration of the first model is suggested by Talcott Parsons, at least the post-war Parsons, and his school, and of the second by the Marxist current and all of its component schools, whatever differences they may have, except both the principle of class struggle and dialectics as a duality operating within society. Note 37. This methodological split, which defines two major kinds of discourse in society, has been handed down in the 19th century. The idea that society forms as an organic whole in the absence of which it ceases to be a society and sociological ceases to have an object of study, dominated the minds of the founders of the French school. Added detail was supplied by functionalism. It took yet another turn in the 1950s with Parsons' conception of society as a self-regulating system. The theoretical and even material model is no longer the living organism. It is provided by cybernetics, which during and after the Second World War expanded the model's applications. In Parsons' work, the principle behind the system is still, if I may say so, optimistic. It corresponds to the stabilization of the growth economies and societies of abundance under the aegis of a modern welfare state. Note 38. In the work of contemporary German theorists, system theory is technocratic and cynical, not to mention despairing. The harmony between the needs and hopes of individuals or groups and functions guaranteed by the system is now only a second of its function. The true goal of the system, the reason it programmed itself like a computer, is the optimization of the global relationship between input and output. In other words, performativity. Even when its rules are in the process of changing and innovations are occurring, even when its dysfunctions, such as strikes, crises, unemployment, or political revolutions, inspire hope and lead to belief in the alternative. Even then, what is actually taking place is only an internal readjustment, and its result can be no more than an increase in the system's viability. The only alternative to this kind of performance improvement is entropy or decline. Note 39. Here again, while avoiding the simplifications inherent in the sociology of social theory, it is difficult to deny at least the parallel between this hard, technocratic version of society and the ascetic effort that was demanded. In fact, that it was done in the name of advanced liberalism is the exciting point. The most highly developed industrial societies, in order to make them competitive and thus optimize their rationality within the framework of the resumption of economic world order in the 1960s. Even taking into account the massive displacement intervening between the thought of a man like Comte or the thought of Luhmann, we can discern a common conception of the social. Society is unified totality, a unicity. Parsons formulates this clearly. The most essential condition of a successful dynamic analysis is a continual and systematic reference of every problem to the state of the system as a whole. A process or set of conditions either contributes to the maintenance or development of the system, or it is dysfunctional in that it detracts from integration, effectiveness, etc. of the system. 40, note 40. The technocrats, note 41, also subscribe to this idea. Whence its credibility, it has the means to become reality, and that is all the proof it needs. This is what Horkheimer called the paranoia of reason, note 42. But this realism of systematic self-regulation and this perfectly sealed circle of facts and interpretations can be judged paranoid only if one has, or claims to have, at one's disposal a viewpoint that is in principle immune from their allure. This is the function of the principle of class struggle in theories of society based on the work of Marx. Traditional theory is always in danger of being incorporated into the programming of the social flow as a simple tool for the optimization of its performance. This is because its desire for unitary and totalizing truth lends itself to the unitary and totalizing practice of the system's managers. Critical theory, note 43, based on a principle of dualism and wary of the sympathies and reconciliations, should be in position to avoid this link. What guides Marxism, then, is a different model of society and a different conception of the function of the knowledge that can be produced by society and acquired from it. This model was born of the struggles accompanying the process of capitalism's encroachment upon traditional civil societies. There is insufficient space here to chart the vicissitudes of these struggles, which fill more than a century of social, political, and ideological history. We will have to content ourselves with a glance at the balance sheet, which is possible for us to tally today now that their fate is known. In countries with liberal or advanced liberal management, the struggles and their instruments have been transformed into regulators of the system. In communist countries, the totalizing model and its totalitarian effect have made a comeback in the name of Marxism itself, and the struggles in question have simply been deprived of its right to exist. Note 44. Everywhere the critique of political economy, the subtitle of Marx's Capital, and its correlate, the critical and alienated society, are used in one way or another as aids in programming the system. Note 45. Everywhere the critique of the political economy, the subtitle of Marx's Capital, and its correlate, critique of alienated society are used in one way or another as aids in programming the system. Note 45. Of course, certain minorities, such as the Frankfurt School or the group Socialism ou Barbarie, note 46, preserve and redefine the critical model in opposition to this process. But the social foundation of the principle of division or class struggle was blurred to the point of losing all its radicality. We cannot conceal the fact that the critical model in the end lost its theoretical standing and was reduced to the status of a utopia or hope. Note 47. A token protest raised in the name of man or reason or creativity or again of some social category such as the third world or the students. Note 48. On which is conferred in the extremis the henceforth improbable function of the critical subject. The sole purpose of this schematic or skeletal reminder has been to specify the problematic in which I intend to frame the question of knowledge in advanced industrial societies, for it is impossible to know what the state of knowledge is, in other words, the problems its development and distribution are facing today, without knowing something of the society within which it is situated. And today, more than ever, knowing about the society involves, first of all, choosing what approach the inquiry will take, and that necessity means choosing how society can answer it. One can decide that the principal goal of knowledge is an indispensable element in the functioning of society and will act in accordance with that decision only if one has already decided that society is a giant machine. Note 49. Conversely, one can count on the
alternative seems clear. It is a choice between homogeneity and the intrinsic duality of the social, between functional and critical knowledge. But the decision seems difficult or arbitrary. It is tempting to avoid the decision altogether by distinguishing two kinds of knowledge. One, the positivist kind, would be directly applicable to technologies bearing on man and materials and would lend itself to operating as an indispensable productive force within the system. The other, the critical, reflexive, or hermeneutic kind, by reflectively directing or indirectly on values or aims, would resist any such recuperation. Note 51. That's the end of part 4, the nature of the social bond, the modern alternative. In a moment I'll begin part 5 of the postmodern condition, the nature of the social bond, the postmodern perspective. I don't know if all the members of the audience are aware of this or not, but I did pass out a packet which has the notes, which I refer to occasionally, and also includes the foreword to the Postmodern Condition, which I won't be reading, by Fredric Jameson. It also has the publishing information in the packet as well, if you're interested in that. It also contains the table of contents of the book, which may give you serve as some sort of program for what I'll be doing today. Part 5, the nature of the social bond, the modern perspective. Just a moment. The image of society this syndrome suggests necessitates a serious revision of the alternative approaches considered. For brevity's sake, suffice to say that functions of regulation and therefore of reproduction are being and will be further withdrawn from administrators and entrusted to machines. Increasingly, the central question is becoming who will have access to the information these machines must have. in storage to guarantee that the right decisions will be made. Access to data is, and will continue to be, the prerogative of experts of all stripes. The ruling class is and will continue to be the class of decision makers. Even now, it is no longer composed of traditional political class, but of a composite layer of corporate leaders, high-level administrators, and the heads of the major professional, labor, political, and religious organizations. Note 42. What is new in all of this is that the old poles of attraction represented by the nation-states, parties, professions, institutions, and historical traditions are losing their attraction, and it does not look as though they will be replaced, at least not on their former scale. The trilateral provision is not a popular pole of attraction. Identifying with the great names and heroes of contemporary history is becoming more and more difficult. Note 43. Dedicating oneself to catching up with Germany, the life goal of the French president, Giscard d'Estaing, at the time this book was published in France, seems to be offering his countrymen. This is not exactly exciting. But then again, it is not exactly a life goal. It depends on each individual's industrialistness. Each individual is referred to himself, and each of us knows that our self does not amount to much. Note 54. This breaking up of the grand narratives discussed below sections 9 and 10 leads to what some authors analyze in terms of the dissolution of the social bond as a disintegration of social aggregates into a mass individual atoms thrown into the absurdity of the Brownian motion. Note 55. Nothing of this kind is happening. This point of view, it seems to me, is haunted by the paradisiac representation of a lost organic society. A self does not amount to much, but no self is an island. Each exists in a fabric of relations that is now more complex and mobile than ever before. Young or old, man or woman, rich or poor, person is always located at nodal points of specific communication circuits, however tiny these may be. Note 56. Or better, one is always located at a post through which various kinds of messages pass. No one, not even the least privileged among us, is entirely powerless over the messages that traverse and position him at the point post of sender, addressee, and referent. One's mobility in relation to these language game effects, language games, of course, are all this is about, is tolerable, at least within certain limits. These limits are vague. It is even solicited by the regulatory mechanisms, and in particular by the self-adjustments the system undertakes in order to improve its performance. It may even be said that the system can and must encourage such movements to be the extent that it combats its own entropy. The novelty of an unexpected move, and with its relative displacement of a partner or group of partners, can supply the system with that increased performativity it whoever demands and consumes. Note 57. It should now be clear from which perspective I chose language games as my general methodological approach. I am not claiming that the entirety of social relations is of this nature. That will remain an open question. But there is no need to resort to some fiction of social origins to establish that language games are the minimum relation required for society to exist. Even before he is born, if only by virtue of his name he is given, the human child is already positioned as the referent in the story recounted by those around him, in relation to which he will inevitably chart his own course. Note 58. Or more simply still, the question of the social bond, insofar as it is a question, is itself a language game, a game of inquiry. It immediately positions the person who asks, as well as the addressee or the referent asked about, is already the social bond. On the other hand, in a society whose communication component is becoming more prominent day by day, both as a reality and as an issue, note 59, it is clear that language assumes a new importance. It would be superficial to reduce its insignificance to the traditional alternative between manipulatory speech and the unilateral transmission of messages on the one hand, and free expression and dialogue on the other. A word on this last point. If the problem is described simply in terms of communication theory, two things are overlooked. First, messages have quite different forms and effects depending on whether they are, for example, denotative, prescriptives, evaluatives, performatives, etc. It is clear that what is important is not simply the fact that they communicate information. Reducing them to this function is to adopt a new outlook, which unduly privileges the system's own interests and points of view. A cybernetic machine does not indeed run on information, but the goals programmed into it. For example, originate in the prescriptive and evaluative statements it has no way to correct in the course of its functioning. For example, maximizing its own performance. How can one guarantee that performance maximization is the best goal for the social system in every case? In any case, the atoms forming its matter are competent to handle statements such as these, and this question in particular. Second, the trivial cybernetic version of information theory misses something on the decisive importance to which I've already called attention, the antagonistic aspect of society. The atoms are placed at the crossroads of the pragmatic relationships, but they are also displaced by the messages that traverse them in perpetual motion. Each language partner, when a move pertaining to him is made, undergoes a displacement, an alteration of some kind that not only affects him in his capacity as addressee and referent, but also as sender. These moves necessarily provoke counter-moves, and everyone knows that a counter-move that is merely reactional is not a good move. Reactional counter-moves are no more than programmed effects in the opponent's strategy. They play into his hands and thus have no effect on the balance of power. That is why it is important to increase displacement in the games and even to disorient it in such a way as to make an unexpected move, a new statement. What is needed if we were to understand social relations in this manner, on whatever scale we choose, is not only a theory of communication, but a theory of games. Which aspects and antagonistics as a founding principle. In this context, it is easy to see that the essential elements of newness is not simply innovation. Support for this approach can be found in the new work of a number of contemporary sociologists, note 60. In addition to linguistics and philosophers of language. This atomization of the social into flexible networks of language games may seem far removed into the modern reality, which is depicted, on the contrary, as afflicted with bureaucratic paralysis, note 61. The objection will be made, at least, that the weight of certain institutions imposes the limits on the games and thus restricts the inventiveness of the players in making their moves. But I think this can be taken into account without causing any particular difficulty. In the ordinary use of discourse, for example, in a discussion between two friends, the interlocutors use any available ammunition, changing games from one utterance to the next. Questions, requests, assertions, and narratives are launched pell-mell into battle. The war is not without rules, note 62. But the rules allow and encourage the greatest possible flexibility of utterance. From this point of view, an institution differs from a conversation in that it always requires supplementary constraints for the statements to be declared admissible within its bounds. The constraints function to filter discursive potentials, interpreting possible connections in the communication networks. These are things that should not be said. They also privilege certain classes of statements, sometimes only one, whose predominance characterizes the discourse of a particular institution. There are the things that should be said, and there are ways of saying them. Thus, orders in any army, prayer in church, denotation in schools, narration in families, questions in philosophy, performativity in business. Bureaucratization is the other limit of this tendency. However, this hypothesis about the institution is too unwieldy. Its point of departure is an overly reifying view of what is institutionalized. We know today that the limits of the institution imposed with potential language moves are never established once and for all, even if they have been formally defined. Note 63. Rather, the limits are themselves the stakes and provisional results of language strategies, within the institution and without. Examples. Does the university have a place of language experiments, poetics? Can you tell stories in a cabinet meeting? Advocate a cause in the barracks? The answer is clear, yes. If the university opens a creative workshop, yes. If the cabinet works with the prospective scenarios, yes. If the limits of the old institution are displaced. Note 64. Reciprocally, it can be said that the boundaries only stabilize when they cease to be the stakes in the game. This, I think, is an appropriate approach to the contemporary institutions of knowledge. That was the end of the nature, part 5, the nature of the social bond of postmodern perspective. In a moment, I'll begin part 6 of the Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard, the pragmatics of narrative knowledge. Part 6, the pragmatics of narrative knowledge. In section 1, I leveled 2 objections against the unquestioning acceptance of instrumental conception of knowledge in the most highly developed societies. Knowledge is not the same as science, especially in its contemporary form, and science, far from successfully obscuring the problem of legitimacy, cannot avoid raising it with all of its implications, which are no less sociopolitical than epistemological. Let us begin with an analysis of the nature of narrative knowledge by providing a point of comparison. Our examination will clarify at least some of the characteristics of the form assumed by the scientific knowledge of contemporary society. In addition, it will aid us in understanding how the question of legitimacy is raised or fails to be raised today. Knowledge is, in general, cannot be reduced to science or even to learning. Learning is the set of statements which, to the exclusion of all other statements, denotate or describe objects and may be declared true or false. Note 65. Science is a subset of learning. It is also composed of denotative statements, but imposes two supplementary conditions of their acceptability. The objects to which they refer must be available for repeated access. In other words, they may be accessible in explicit conditions of observation. And it must be possible to decide whether or not a given statement pertains to the language judged relevant by the experts. Note 66. What is meant by the term knowledge is not only a set of denotative statements, far from it. It also includes notions of know-how, knowing how to live, how to listen, etc. Knowledge, then, is a question of competence that goes beyond the simple determination and the application of the criterion of truth, extending to the determination and application of the criterion of efficiency. Technical qualification of justice and or happiness, ethical wisdom, of the beauty of a sound or color, auditory or visual sensibility, etc. Understood in this way, knowledge is what makes something capable of forming good denotative utterances, but also good prescriptive and good evaluative utterances. It is not a competence relative to a particular class of statements, for example, cognitive ones, to the exclusion of all others. On the contrary, it makes good performances in relation to a variety of objects of a discourse possible. Objects to be known, decided on, evaluated, transformed. From this derives one of the principal features of knowledge. It coincides with an extensive array of competence-building measures and is the only form embodied in a subject constituted by the various areas of competence composing it. Another characteristic of meriting special attention is the relation between the special knowledge and the kind of knowledge and a custom. What is a good prescriptive or evaluative utterance, a good performance in a denotative or technical matters? They are all just to be good because they conform to a relative criteria of justice, beauty, truth, and efficiency, respectively. Accepted in the social circle of the knowers, interlocutors, the early philosophers called this mode of legitimation statements opinion. Note 67. The consensus that permits such knowledge to be circumscribed. The consensus that permits such knowledge to be circumscribed and makes it possible to distinguish one who knows a form. The consensus that permits such knowledge to be circumscribed and makes it possible to distinguish one who knows from one who doesn't, the foreigner, the child, is what constitutes the culture of people. Note 68. The brief remainder of what knowledge can be in the way of training and culture draws on the ethnological description for its justification. Note 69. But anthropological studies and literature that takes rapidly developing societies as their object contest to the survival of this type of knowledge within them, at least in some of their sectors. Note 70. The very idea of development presupposes a horizon of non-development, where it is assumed the various areas of competence remain enveloped in the unity of a tradition and are not differentiated according to separate qualifications subject to specific innovations, debates, and inquiries. This opposition does not necessarily imply a difference in nature between primitive and civilized man. Note 71. But is compatible with the premise of the formal identity between the savage mind and scientific thought. Note 72. It is even compatible with the apparently contrary premise of the superiority of customary knowledge over the contemporary dispersion of competence. Note 73. It is fair to say that there is one point on which all of the investigations agree, regardless of the scenario they propose to dramatize and understand the distance separating the customary state of knowledge and from its state in the scientific age, the preeminence of the narrative form in the formulation of traditional knowledge. Some study this form for its own sake, note 74. Others see it as a diachronic custom of the structural operators that, according to them, properly constitute the knowledge in question. Note 75. Still others bring it to an economic interpretation of the Freudian sense of the term. Note 76. All that is important here is that the fact that its form is narrative. Narration is the quintessential form of customary knowledge in more ways than one. First, the popular stories themselves recount what could be called as positive or negative apprenticeships. In other words, the successes or failures greeting the hero's undertakings. These successes or failures either bestow legitimacy upon social institutions, the functions of myths, or represent positive or negative models, the successful or unsuccessful hero, of integration into established institutions, legends, and tales. Thus, the narrative allows the society in which they are told, on the one hand, to define its criteria of competence, and on the other, to evaluate in accordance to these criteria what is performed and what can be performed within it. Second, the narrative form, unlike the developed forms of the discourse of knowledge, lends itself to a great variety of language games. Denotative statements concerning, for example, the state of the sky and of the flora and the fauna easily slip in. So do deonate statements prescribing what should be done with respect to these reference, or with respect to kinship, the difference between the sexes, children, neighbors, foreigners, etc. Interrogative statements are implied, for example, in episodes involving challenges. Respond to a question, choose one from a number of things. Evaluative statements also enter in, etc. The area of competence whose criteria the narrative supplies or applies are thus tightly woven together in a web of forms, ordered by the unified viewpoint characteristic of this kind of knowledge. We shall examine in somewhat more detail a third property, which relates to the transmission of narratives. Their narration usually obeys rules that define the pragmatics of their transmission. I do not mean to say that a given society institutionally assigns the role of narrative to certain categories on the basis of age, sex, or the role of narrative to certain categories on the basis of age, sex, or family or professional group. What I'm getting at is the pragmatics of the popular narratives, that is, so to speak, intrinsic to them. For example, of the Kishanahua, note 77, storyteller always begins his narration with a fixed formula. Here is the story of, as I've always heard it told, I will tell it to you in my turn, listen. And he brings it to a close with another, also invariable formula. Here ends the story of, the man who told it to you is Kashinahua name, or to the man, or to the whites, Spanish or Portuguese name. Note 78. A quick analysis of this double pragmatic construction reveals the following. The narrator's only claim to competence for telling the story is the fact that he has heard it himself. The current narratee gains potential access to the same authority simply by listening. It is claimed that the narrative is a faithful transmission, even if the narrative performance is highly inventive, and that it has been told forever. Therefore, the hero Kashinahuan, was himself once a narratee, and perhaps a narrator, of the very same story. This similarity and contradiction allows for the possibility that the current narrative could be the hero of the narrative, just as the ancestor was. In fact, he is necessarily such a hero because he bears a name declined at the end of his narration, and that the name was given to him in conformity with the canonic narrative, legitimizing the assignment patronyms among the Kashinahuan. The pragmatic rule illustrated by this example cannot, of course, be universalized, note 79. But it gives insight into what is generally recognized property of traditional knowledge. The narrative posts, sender, addressee, and hero, are so organized that the right to occupy the post of sender receives the following double grounding. It is based upon the fact of having occupied the post of addressee and of having been counted oneself by virtue of the name one bears by a previous narrative. In other words, having been positioned as the diegetic reference of the other narrative events, note 80. The knowledge transmitted by these narrations is in no way limited to the functions of enunciation. It determines in a single stroke what one must say in order to be heard, what one must listen in order to speak, and what role one must play on the scene of the diegetic reality to be the object of narrative. Thus, the speech acts, note 81, relevant to this form of knowledge, are performed not only by the speaker but also by the listener, as well as by the third party referred to. Knowledge arising from such an apparatus may seem condensed in comparison with what I call developed knowledge. Our example clearly illustrates that a narrative tradition is also the narrative of the criteria defining a threefold competence: knowing how to speak and knowing how to hear, through which the community's relationship to itself and to its environment is played out. What is transmitted through these narratives is the set of pragmatic rules that constitutes the social bond. A fourth aspect of the narrative knowledge meriting careful examination is its effect on time. Narrative form follows a rhythm. It is the synthesis of the meter beating time in regular periods of the accent modifying the length of an amplitude or certain of those periods, note 82. This vibratory musical property of narrative is clearly revealed in the ritual performance of certain Kashenahuan tales. They are handed down in initiation ceremonies in absolutely fixed form, in a language whose meaning is obscured by lexical and syntactical anomalies, and they are sung as interminable monotonous chants. Note 83. It is a strange brand of knowledge, you may say, that does not even make itself understood to the young man to whom it is addressed. And yet, this kind of knowledge is quite common. Nursery rhymes are of this type, and repetitive forms of contemporary music have tried to recapture, or at least approximate it. It exhibits a surprising feature, as meter takes precedence over accent in the production of sound, spoken or not. Time ceases to be a support for memory to become an abnormal beating, that is, in the absence of a noticeable separation between periods, prevents their being numbered or consigns them into oblivion. Note 84. Consider the form of popular sayings, proverbs, and maxims. They are like little splinters of potential narratives, or molds of old ones, which have been continued to circulate on certain levels of contemporary social edifice. In their placidity can be recognized the mark of that strange temporalization that jars the golden rule of our knowledge: never forget. Now there must be a congruence between this lethal function of narrative knowledge and the function cited earlier of criteria formation, the unification of areas of competence and social regulation. By way of simplifying fiction, we can hypothesize that, against all expectations, a collectivity that takes narrative as its key form of competence has no need to remember its past. It finds the raw material for its social bond not only in the meaning of the narratives it recounts, but also in the act of receiving them. The narrative's reference may seem to belong to the past, but in reality it always occupies contemporaries with the act of recitation. It is the present act that on each of its occurrences marshals the ephemeral temporality in inhabiting the space between I have heard and you have heard. The important thing about the pragmatic protocol of this kind of narration is that it betokens a theoretical identity between each of narrative's occurrences. This may not, in fact, be the case, and often is not, and we should not blind ourselves to the element of humor or anxiety noticeable in the respect this etiquette inspires. The fact remains that what is emphasized is the metrical beat of the narrative occurrences, not each performance's differences in accent. It is in this sense that this mode of temporality can be said to be simultaneously efficient and moral. Note 85. Finally, a culture that gives precedence to the narrative form doubtless has no more of a need for special procedures to authorize its narratives than it has to remember its past. It is hard to imagine such a culture first isolating the post of narrator from the others in order to give it a privileged status in narrative pragmatics. Then inquiring into what right the narrator, who is thus disconnected from the narratee or diegesis, might have to recount what he recounts. And finally, undertaking the analysis or anemesis of its own legitimacy, it is even hard to imagine handling over the authority for its narratives to some incomprehensible subject of narration. the narratives themselves have this authority. In a sense, the people are only that which actualizes the narrative. Once again, they not only by recounting them, but also by listening to them and recounting themselves through them. In other words, by putting them into play in their own institutions, thus by assigning themselves the posts of narrative and diegesis, as well as the post of narrator. There is then an incomprehensibility between popular narrative and pragmatics, which provides immediate legitimation and the language game known to the West as the question of legitimacy, or rather legitimacy as the referent in the game of inquiry. Narratives, as we have seen, determine criteria of competence and or illustrate how they are to be applied. They will thus define what has the right to be said and done in the culture in question. And since they are themselves a part of that culture, they are legitimated by the simple fact that they do what they do. That's the end of part 6, entitled The Pragmatics of Narrative Knowledge. In a moment I'll be continuing with part 7 of the Postmodern Condition, The Pragmatics of Scientific Knowledge. There's 13 parts, and plus an appendix, which I'll be reading, which is entitled, What is Postmodernism?
It's a
now begin part 7, the pragmatics of scientific knowledge. Let us attempt to characterize, if only in summary fashion, the classical conception of the pragmatics of scientific knowledge. In the process, we will distinguish between the research game and the teaching game. Copernicus states that the path of the planets is circular. Note 86. Whether this proposition is true or false, it carries within it a set of tensions, all of which affect each of the pragmatic posts it brings into play. Sender, addressee, and referent. These tensions are classes of prescriptions which regulate the admissibility of the statement as scientific. First, the sender should speak the truth about the referent, the path of the planets. What does this mean? That on the one hand, he is supposed to be able to provide proof of what he says, and on the other hand, he is supposed to be able to refute any opposing or contradictory statements concerning the same referent. Second, it should be possible for the addressee validly to give or refuse his assent to the statement he hears. This implies that he is himself a potential sender, since when he formulates his agreement or disagreement, he will be subject to the same double requirement, or proof of refutation. That Copernicus was, he therefore is supposed to have, or potentially, the same qualities as Copernicus. He is his equal. But this will only become known when he speaks, and under the Vogt conditions. Before that, it will be impossible to say whether or not he is a scientific scholar. Third, the referent, the path of the planets, of which Copernicus speaks, is supposed to be expressed by his statement in conformity with what it actually is. But since what it is can only be known through statements of the same order as that of Copernicus, the rule of adequation becomes problematical. What I say is true because I prove that it is, but what proof is there that my proof is true? The scientific solution of this difficulty consists in the observance of two rules. First of these is dialectical or even rhetorical in the forensic sense. Note 87. A referent is that which is susceptible to proof and which can be used as evidence for debate. Not, I can prove something because reality is the way I say it, but as long as I can produce proof, it is permissible to think that reality is in the way that I say it is. Note 88. The second rule is metaphysical. The same referent cannot supply plurality of contradictory or inconsistent proofs. Or stated differently, God is not deceptive. Note 89. These two rules underlie what 19th century science calls verification, or 20th century science falsification. Note 90. They allow a horizon of consensus to be brought to the debate between partners, the sender or the addressee. Not every consensus is a sign of truth, but it is presumed that the truth of a statement necessarily draws a consensus. That covers research. It should be evident that research appeals to teaching as it is necessary to complement. The scientists need an addressee who can in turn become the sender. He needs a partner.
Otherwise, the verification of his statements would be impossible, since the non-renewal of the requisite skills could eventually bring an end to the necessary contradictory debate. Not only the truth of a scientist's statement, but also his competence is at stake in that debate. One's competence is never an accomplished fact. It depends on whether or not the statement proposed is considered by one's peers to be worth discussion in a sequence of argumentation and refutation. The truth of the statement and the competence of its sender are thus subject to the collective approval of a group of persons who are competent on an equal basis. Equals are needed and must be created. Didactics is what ensures that this reproduction take place. It is different from the dialectical game of research. Briefly, its first presupposition is that the addressee, the student, does not know what the sender knows. Obviously, that is why he has something to learn. Its second presupposition is that the student can learn what the sender knows and become an expert whose competence is equal to that of the master. Note 91. This double requirement supposes a third, that there are statements for which the exchange of arguments and the production of proof constituting the pragmatics of research are considered to have been sufficient, and which can therefore be transmitted through teaching as they stand, in the guise of indisputable truths. In other words, you teach what you know, such as the expert, but as the student, the addressee of the didactic process, improves his skills, the expert can confide to him what he does not know, but is trying to learn, at least if the expert is also involved in research. In this way, the student is introduced to the dialectics of research, or the game of produced scientific knowledge. If we compare the pragmatics of science to that of narrative knowledge, we note the following properties. 1. Scientific knowledge requires that one language game, denotation, be retained and all others excluded. A statement's truth value is the criterion determining its acceptability. Of course, we find other classes of statements, such as interrogatives. How can we explain the classes of statements such as... Of course, we find other classes of statements such as interrogatives. How can we explain that? And prescriptives take a finite series of elements. But they are only present as turning points in the dialectical argumentation. What must end in a denotative statement? Note 92. In this context, then, one is learned if one can produce a true statement about a referent, and one is a scientist if one can produce variable or falsifiable statements about reference accessible to the experts. Number 2. Scientific knowledge, in this way, set apart from the language games that combine to form the social bond. Unlike narrative knowledge, it is no longer a more direct and shared component of the bond, but is indirectly a component of it because it develops into the profession and gives rise to institutions, and in modern society's language games consolidate themselves in the form of institutions run by qualified partners, the professional class. The relation between general agonistics, excluding scientists in their professional capacity, becomes one of mutual exteriority. A new problem appears, that of the relationship between the scientific institution and society. Can this problem be solved by didactics, for example, by the premise that any social atom can acquire scientific competence? Number 3. Within the bounds of the game of research, the competence required concerns the post of sender alone. There is no particular competence required of the above addressee. It is required only in didactics. The student must be intelligent. And there is no competence required of the referent. Even in the case of human sciences, where it is an aspect of human contact, the referent is in principle external to the partners engaged in scientific dialectics. Here, in contrast to the narrative game, a person does not have to know Here, in contrast to the narrative game, a person does not have to know how to be what knowledge says he is. Number 4. A statement of science gains no validity from the fact of being reported. Even in the case of pedagogy, it is taught only if it is still verifiable at the present through argumentation and proof. In itself, it is never secure from falsification. Note 93. The knowledge that has accumulated in the form of already accepted statements can always be challenged, but conversely, any new statement that contradicts a previously proved statement regarding the same referent can be accepted as valid only if it refutes the previous statement by producing arguments and proofs. Number 5. The game of science thus implies a diachronic temporality, that is, a memory and a project. The current sender of a scientific statement is supposed to be acquainted with previous statements concerning its referent, bibliography, and only proposes a new statement on the subject if it differs from the previous ones. Here what I have called the accent of each performance, and by that token a polemical function of the game, takes precedence over the meter. This diachrony, which assumes memory and a search for the new, represents in principle a cumulative process. Its rhythm, or the relationship between the accent and meter, is variable. Note 94. These properties are well known, but they are worth recalling for 2 reasons. First, drawing a parallel between science and non-science, narrative knowledge, helps us understand, or at least sense, that the former's existence is no more, and no less, necessary than the latter's. Both are comprised of sets of statements. The statements are moves made by the players within the framework of generally applicable rules. These rules are specific to each particular kind of knowledge, and the moves judged to be good in one cannot be of the same type as those judged good in another, unless it happens that way by chance. It is therefore impossible to judge the existence or validity of narrative knowledge on the basis of scientific knowledge, and vice versa. The relevant criteria are different. All we can do is gaze in wonderment at the diversity of discursive species, just as we do at the diversity of plant or animal species. Lamenting the loss of meaning in postmodernity boils down to mourning the fact that knowledge is no longer principally narrative. Such a reaction does not necessarily follow. Neither does an attempt to derive or engender, using operators like development, scientific knowledge from narrative knowledge, as if the former contained the latter in an embryonic state. Nevertheless, language species, like living species, are interrelated, and their relations are far from harmonious. The second point, justifying this quick reminder of the properties of language game of scientific concerns, precisely its relation to narrative knowledge. I have said that narrative knowledge does not give priority to the question of its own legitimation, and that it certifies itself in the pragmatics of its own transmission without having recourse to argumentation and proof. This is why its incomprehension of the problems of scientific discourse is accompanied by certain tolerance. It approaches such discourse primarily as a variant in the family of narrative cultures. Note 95. The opposite is not true. The scientist questions the validity of narrative statements and concludes that they are never subject to argumentation or proof. Note 96. He classifies them as belonging to an alienated composed of opinions, customs, authority, prejudice, ignorance, and ideology. Narratives are fables, myths, legends, fit only for women and children. At best, attempts are made to throw some rays of light onto this obscurantism to civilize, educate, develop. This unequal relationship is an intrinsic of effort of the rules specific to each game. We all know its symptoms. It is the entire history of culture imperialism from the dawn of Western civilization. It is important to recognize its special tenor, which sets it apart from all other forms of imperialism. It is governed by the demand for legitimation. That ends part 7, which was entitled The Pragmatics of Scientific Knowledge. In a moment I will begin part 8, The Narrative Function and the Legitimation of Knowledge.
Begin part 8, Postmodern Condition. Part 8 is entitled The Narrative Function and the Legitimation of Knowledge. The Narrative Function and the Legitimation of Knowledge. Today, the problem with legitimation is no longer considered a failing of the language game of silence. It would be more accurate to say that it has itself been legitimated as a problem. That is, as a heuristic driving force. But this way of dealing with it, by reversing the situation, is of recent date. Before it came to this point, what some call positivism, scientific knowledge sought other solutions. It is remarkable that for a long time it could not help resorting for its solutions to procedures that, overtly or not, belong to narrative knowledge. This return of the narrative in the non-narrative, in one form or the other, should not be thought of as having been superseded once and for all. A crude proof of this: what do scientists do when they appear on television or interviewed in the newspapers after making a discovery? They recount an epic of knowledge that is in fact wholly unepic. They play by the rules of the narrative game. Its influence remains considerable not only on the users of the media, but also on the scientists' sentiments. This fact is neither trivial nor accessory. It concerns the relationship of scientific knowledge to popular knowledge, or what is left of it. The state spends large amounts of money to enable science to pass itself off as an epic. The state's own credibility is based on that epic, which it uses to obtain the public consent its decision-makers need. Note 97. It is not inconceivable that the recourse to narrative is inevitable, at least to the extent that the language game of science desires its statements to be true, but does not have the resources to legitimate their truth on its own. If this is the case, it is necessary to admit an irreducible need for history understood, as outlined above, not as a need to remember or to project, a need of historicity for accent, but on the contrary, as a need to forget, a need for metrum. See section 6. We are anticipating ourselves, but as we proceed, we should keep in mind that the apparently obsolete solutions that have been found for the problem of legitimation are not obsolete in principle, only in their expression. We should not be surprised if we find that they have existed to this day in other forms. Do not we ourselves at this moment feel obliged to mount a narrative of scientific knowledge in the West in order to clarify its status? The new language game of science posed the problem of its own legitimation at the very beginning in Plato. This is not the proper place for an exegesis of the passages in the dialogues in which the pragmatics of science is set in motion, either explicitly as a theme or implicitly as a presupposition. This game of dialogue, with its specific requirements, encapsulates that pragmatics enveloping within itself two functions of research and teaching.
We encounter some of the same rules previously enumerated, argumentation with a view only to consensus or homology. We encounter some of the same rules previously enumerated. Argumentation. We encounter some of the same rules previously enumerated. Argumentation with a view only to consensus. The unicity of the referent as a guarantee for the possibility of agreement. Parity between partners, and even in direct recognition that is a question of the game and not a destiny. Since those who refuse to accept the rules out of weakness or crudeness are excluded. Note 98. There remains the fact that, given some scientific nature of the game, the question of its own legitimacy must be among those raised in the dialogue. A well-known example of this, which is all the more important since it links this question to that of socio-political authority from the start, is to be found in books 6 and 7 on the Republic. As we know, the answer, at least part of it, comes in form of a narrative, the allegory of the cave, which recounts how and why men yearn for narratives and fail to recognize knowledge. Knowledge is thus founded on the narrative of its own margin. There is more. The legitimation effort of the dialogues of Plato gives ammunition to the narrative by the virtue of its own form. Each of the dialogues takes the form of narrative as a scientific discussion. It is of little consequence here that the story of the debate is shown rather than reported, staged rather than narrated, note 99, and therefore is more closely related to tragedy than epic. The fact is that the Platonic discourse that inaugurates science is not scientific, precisely to the extent that it attempts to legitimate science. Scientific knowledge cannot know and make known that it is not the truth knowledge without resorting to the other narrative kind of knowledge, which from its point of view is no knowledge at all. Without such recourse, it would be in the position of presupposing its own validity and would be stooping to what it condemns, begging the question of proceeding on prejudice. But does it not fall into the same trap by using narrative as its authority? This is not the place to chart the recurrence of the narrative in the scientific by the way of the latter's discourses and legitimation, which include, but are not limited to, the great ancient, medieval, and classical philosophies. Endless torment. As resolute a philosophy as that of Descartes can only demonstrate the legitimacy of science through what Leotard calls the story of the mind, note 100. Or else in the Bulldog's Roman, which is what the discourse on method amounts to, Aristotle was doubtless one of the most modern of all in separating the rules to which statements declared scientific must conform, the organdum, from the search for their legitimacy in the discourse of being, the metaphysics. Even more modern was his suggestion that the scientific knowledge, including its pretensions to express the being of the referent, is composed only of arguments and proofs, in other words, of dialectics, note 101. With modern science, two new features appear in the problematic of legitimation. To begin with, it leaves behind the metaphysical search for first proof of transcendental authority as a response to the question, how do you prove the proof, or more generally, who decide the conditions of proof? It is recognized that the conditions of proof, in other words, the rules of the game of science, are immanent in that game, that they can only be established within the bonds of a debate that is already scientific in nature, and that there is no other proof that the rules are good than the consensus extended to them by the experts. Accompanying the modern proclivities to define the conditions of discourse and the discourse on these conditions is a renewed dignity for narrative popular cultures, already noticeable in Renaissance humanism and variously present in the Enlightenment, the Sturm und Drang, German idealist philosophy, and the historical school in France. Narration is no longer an involuntary lapse in the legitimation process. The explicit appeal to narrative in the problematic of knowledge is contaminated with the liberation of the bourgeois classes from the traditional authorities. Narrative knowledge makes a resurgence in the West as a way of solving the problem of legitimating the new authorities. It is a narrative in the narrative problematic for such a question to solicit the name of a hero as its response. Who has the right to decide for society? Who is the subject whose prescriptions are norms for those they obligate? This way of inquiring into socio-political legitimacy combines with new scientific attitude. The name of the hero is the people. The sign of legitimacy is the people's consensus, and their mode of creating norms is deliberation. The notion of progress is necessary outgrowth of this. It represents nothing other than the movement by which knowledge is presumed to accumulate. But this movement is extended to the social-political subject. The people debate among themselves about what is just or unjust in the same way that the scientific community debates about what is true or false. They accumulate civil laws just as scientists accumulate scientific laws. They perfect their rules of consensus just as scientists produce new paradigms to revise their rules in light of what they have learned. Note 102. It is clear that what is meant here by the people is entirely different from what is implied by the traditional narrative knowledge, which, as we have seen, requires to